Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. No matter where you are, I hope you guys are well. Welcome to Architects Fast Forward webinar series. My name is Amelia, a Masa representative, and I'll be your MC for today. Firstly, I'd like to thank Architects 2021 for giving Masa an opportunity to conduct this session. We are pleased to have this collaboration with Architects. I see some of our viewers are building material suppliers, manufacturers or brands. If you want to discover the new way to connect and meet architects and specifiers in this new digital era, just click on the link that we have just posted in the comments. Now, for those who don't know what MASA is, I hope you can lend me your ear as I explain further. MASA stands for Malaysia Architecture Students Alliance, and it is a non-profit student committee operating directly under Pertubuhan Architect Malaysia, or in short, PAM, consisting of student representatives from all architecture institutes in Malaysia. It is a platform where Malaysian architecture students join forces to learn and share with appreciation of the past, generating sustainable living in the present and bringing unlimited possibilities to the future. Our mission is to develop an effective platform and network between Malaysian architecture students and professionals. We also serve as liaisons between students and PAM. Now, let us greet our special guests for today. We present to you once again the chairman of PAM Education Committee, Architect Adrianta Aziz, and the one and only Mr. Phil Kim, who will be talking to us on the topic dense places and scripted cities. To begin with, let us welcome Architect Adrianta to say a few words.
Right, all right. Hi, Amelia. Thank you so much for your introduction. How are you?
I'm good, Architect. How about you?
How are you? Good. Not too bad. So, thank you so much, Amelia. And on behalf of PAM, I can see yourself and your friends, Masa Committee, have done a good job. Even though you are students so busy with your assignments, your submissions, this is a good exploration and good experience for you, especially that you can contribute yourself, your time in this platform. Thank you so much, Emilia. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, welcome everybody. Welcome everybody. We see you again to Architects Fast Forward webinar series. 12 August, year 2021. So thank you again to Architects Digital Platforms for this platform. We call it Webinar Education Series supported by PAM and also from Acacia. So I can see that today is a beautiful day with a very interesting topic as myself, that as an architect, urban designers, and also a placemaker, to have our speakers all the way from Hong Kong, Mr. Phil Kim, with this topic, dense places and scripted cities. So let me introduce Mr. Phil Kim. He's a board member, shareholder, and managing director, Asia Pacific at the JERDE Partnership Incorporation in Los Angeles and Hong Kong. So he focuses on JERDE's constantly evolving place-making ideas and coding of complex urban projects that has impacted fast-evolving cities and has helped rejuvenated Asia cities with a recognition of over 150 international design awards. Well, Mr. Phil Kim, he also advises private and public companies on innovations in mixed-use design, retail, urban revitalization, vertical cities, and building social sustainability and the value of place. Langham Place, Hong Kong, Roppongi Hills, Tokyo, Queen's Wharf, Brisbane, and the Quay Quarter, Sydney, are some of the past and present notable projects representative of a people-based design that draws over 1 billion visitors to JERDE projects around the world annually in 20 countries. So as a member and volunteer for the Urban Land Institute, Mr. Phil Kim is currently a global governing trustee, co-chair of the education program Urban Plan for Hong Kong and Asia, and a member of the Hong Kong Executive Council. Well, students, with this talk title today, Dense Places and Scripted Cities, is an interesting topic that we would explore deconstructing uses, redefining the individual relationship to a place absorbing constant change and requiring reformulation of buildings and precincts. Well, defining a new uses defines shape and form ideas that have governed large-scale work for 50 years in the most accelerated urban transformation in history. The next steps of urban cores involve physical and social coding to adapt to the habits and desire of inhabitants that demand emergent places. The blended cities reflect massive demographic change, demand responses from the design professionals that is future forward, data driven, and programmed for vibrant human response. The Commons Bangkok, Key Quarter Sydney, and projects will be used to illustrate this movement. So I can't wait to hear Mr. Phil Kim to share with us. So let's welcome Mr. Phil Kim. Hi, Phil. How are you?
Hi, Adriana. Thank you for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to be here with you guys.
Right. On behalf of Pam and also Masa, we is honored and thank you so much. I would love to say to you that you can spend time with us, share your experience, share your knowledge, especially for the Malaysian architecture student, and I believe around the world watching this as well on the Acacia platform. So without further ado, I pass it to you. Let's begin with your talk, Phil.
Sure. Thank you so much. I'll start with just a couple of very quick remarks because I've had the pleasure of working in and around Malaysia for about a 15-year period. So, maybe from a student perspective, you may not know them as well, but some of the leading companies in Malaysia, such as EcoWorld and SP Setia and ENO, have been really loyal clients for a long period of time. And really what I'm about to say over the next 30 to 40 minutes really tracks also the evolution of my conversations with them as they really begin to impact cities there. But JERDE operates in about 20 countries annually, and we have the luxury, in a way, of learning from things that are happening in extreme places everywhere, and we try our best to try to localize what we learn for each of the cities. So this is a bit of a reflection using a few case studies that hopefully you get a sense of what is happening within the cities. And of course, as you study and move forward, part of the idea that we have is that the somewhat the traditions from Palladio and Le Corbusier and Mies van der Rohe to today, those are part of the shape and form and the history of architecture that we all participate in. But from our perspective of how cities are evolving, what we are exploring is more of an inside-out relationship to designing human experiences first, and then finding out how to actually put the form and structure in place after, especially because we're in such a critical and adaptive time. But I do want to say, introduce one person just to come over, because it's not just one person. There's a lot of us involved in our work. This is Teresa Wan, who works with me in Hong Kong, and she's a senior architect for us who's been involved in a lot of projects around the region as well. And so we've kind of designed this talk together. Okay, thanks. So what you're accustomed to seeing, and hopefully, I'm a lot older than you guys are, but the traditions of how different city structures and form have informed the history of our civilization, that all matters. And whether it's something as iconic as the Manhattan grid or the inflections that you see in older towns, particularly the European ones, which are a lot more idiosyncratic, but have retained its kind of form and interest over time. So from a physical sense, that's how we have learned to program cities. But if you look at the image on the right, which is really a map showing the tweets, I think the whole idea of digital and data analytics informing as much as road systems and mass transit, the way our cities evolve, that's a part that you're all going to be participating in a lot more than somebody of my generation, although it's affecting me today. Okay. So if we could play the first video, it's just to get a sense of the speed of our cities. And images such as a crossing at Shibuya really is indicative of the dynamism of the region that we all live and work and study in. And I think it's an amazing time. It is truly the Asia century, and I've been living and operating out of Asia for over 20 years now. And although I'm Korean American, really the maturity of thought behind how architecture and urban planning really works has really been informed by the rapid urbanization over the last 20 to 30 years. And we're all participating in a truly historical time, which is even further complicated, not just because of COVID, but because of this mix of technology and old world, where emergent behavior and technologies in cities have yet to be clearly defined. And I guess your opportunity really is that by the time you are practicing, you're the ones who probably will, as digital natives, have the most intuitive sense of how all this is supposed to evolve. If we could play the next video also. We also operate in a place where, because of mass transit, the ability to urbanize at such a steep rate is done relatively sustainably, simply because our delivery system in terms of transport is so highly efficient. So if we could play just a few seconds of this next video, please.
お願いします。頑張ってください。閉めてください。
So, my friends in North America don't actually know that there are such professions as pushers in a Tokyo railway station, but it's all for good cause. So the way we really look at cities has to be in a much more flexible and adaptive kind of way. And you look at various kind of metrics that traditionally for architects were not really utilized as fully as it actually should be. Populations, the way that it can work in cities like New York City or Manhattan during the daytime, and then mass exodus out to the suburbs is somewhat the traditional kind of behavior. Although, again, in Asia metropolises, that relationship is much more integrated. We tend to live in urban cores a lot more than in first world countries or Western countries. The idea of adaptation, I think, is a really huge one, where although we're always participating in sort of newer shaping and form making, where technology and parametrics and innovation is so readily available, when we begin to look at cities, we're also equally fascinated by insertions of human behavior, where things like simple traditional markets that can be taken up and down and constantly adapt in terms of its uses or offering to what human beings desire, it has as much equity as anything else. Our head office is in Los Angeles, and it's a very strange city in a sense, but it's really a collection of individual neighborhoods. And this idea of neighborhoods, the way they need to operate as a self-contained community, is a really important one, despite the obvious downfall of a sprawl like in Los Angeles, where traditionally the usage of cars was the way to connect everything. So LA has a very poor mass transit system, needs to really try to improve in order for it to continue to evolve. Although possible technologies such as autonomous vehicles may provide a solution for being able to link people together, and where technology has some part of a solution. Cities like Kuala Lumpur, for instance, and Bangkok still have and exhibit these traditional ways of actually solving transport, which is an issue when people have so much downtime and an inability to optimize all of the 24/7 experience. So we have to figure out different ways to try to resolve this. The future of work, I think, is a really important one, especially coming out of COVID, where the idea of a third place has been discussed for probably 2 decades. But third places in Asia in particular, because of lack of public space in emerging market cities, often was used in terms of regional shopping center, for instance, where people kind of tend to gather in suburban neighborhoods. But within cities, the formal role of the office now is being completely re-examined. So urban core locations are in great debate about the future of the office. Generally, I would say with the cities that we're in discussions with and core operators, offices are not going away, but the nature of it has to adapt significantly, since we now have to allow for flex time, the ability to work sometimes from home in third places as well as office. And the role of office really does change to create more conversations, higher value experiences, and content generation. So the blended city is something that a friend of mine, Professor Greg Clark in London, has really championed, which is a complete immersion of the physical city with the virtual city. And along with this is really this idea of a distributed network where both in terms of technology and physical work, but also via communications, allow us to look at all locations as potentially viable one, rather than, again, urban core as primary and then everything else being secondary. The idea of change, and in this case, purposeful change, I think is another very important idea that's really come about. Again, because of COVID conditions, the idea of being in safer conditions, part of it has to do with really working with the ecology and organic conditions where outdoor, relatively good air, fresh air, and the ability for people to meet in safer conditions means that there's a bigger movement back towards occupying our public spaces. The street is fundamentally one of the most important devices that's ever been created, and sometimes overly legislated. But all over the world right now, people are trying to figure out better ways of actually using it for human experiences, rather than, in this case, what used to be a car park or sometimes roads. Cities like Shanghai, for instance, are in an interesting position in that, as wonderful as a city as it actually is, 25% of all landmass in Shanghai is actually used for roads. And if we think about the way that transport works and the inefficiency of delivering one individual via private cars, even with the mass transit system there, that's really not a sustainable way for cities to use land in a purposeful and sustainable way. We also have to look at changes, and this is really pre-COVID, but COVID certainly has accelerated this. We look at a lot of different cities, and we've been working in Japan for nearly 30 years. And unlike the work that we did traditionally in cities like Tokyo and Osaka, when we look at some of the prefectures now, it's really much more of an issue about lifestyle. And we are able to work really from anywhere, theoretically, especially if main government bodies and companies allow for the flexibility for us to be able to contribute using technology. So the idea of being much closer to nature, being in charge of safe food production, having a blended lifestyle that is much healthier, and really using biophilic principles to design a life that is sustainable is really a primary driver for secondary and tertiary cities. So we work with some cities and some city mayors, and these are not cities that you might be aware of, but it is providing another look and another future for places in Japan which was really losing its population. And if you look at the demographics of Japan, it's been in a negative population decline for, close to 25 or 30 years, where economies have essentially stopped, other than the mega cities of Tokyo and Osaka. But when you look at these areas, there's definitely a movement from especially the millennial classes towards these cities where I think arguably the millennials have a better sense of overall global ethics and ideas of sustainability, and they're willing to accept that they may not have the same kind of careers or have the desire to have those careers in exchange for a better life. And that's giving cities like this a real opportunity for formerly urban professionals to get into things like farming and cooking and hospitality. Okay. So as part of our movement, we have in Kawagyo in Japan, this idea has actually also affected the way we look at government centers. So this relatively small project for us is a vertical government center which is linked to mass transit and train station, but also walkable to the old town, where interesting ideas about how to vertically separate different kind of functions. So there are specifically programmed retail components to generate income, but also clear and conscious public space with government facilities that actually act as a municipal center. And along with that, what's really important is also along the primary trail to provide walking routes that tie to mass transit stations, but also there's a whole separate path for women to provide a more safe environment for them. So you're kind of seeing the linkages from the site in the south to the urban core areas, and the idea of all these active pathways. And so, if we think about the way that one might design a promenade within a project itself, our work involves now designing promenades that actually provide connective tissue through key neighborhoods and key transport hubs around these cities. Okay, it's okay, we can skip this one. With the idea of work, we've been involved in a number of projects around the world where what we're trying to do is to break down traditional and functional uses. And again, it's been way too long since I've been a student, so I don't know exactly whether you're involved in this from an academic perspective, but we're involved in challenging what we would call development briefs and program. So when a city, like in this case in Sydney, says there's an office building and some shops and food and restaurants and other kind of functions, what we do first is not simply to begin to design to that in terms of traditional shape and form, but we begin to look at it in terms of the future and whether that program actually will allow for the way human beings want to behave and what they desire, and we begin to challenge this. So this diagram is a simple section diagram, but what it does is to take what used to be a high street retail and F&B offer and offices above, and begin to mix program where things from the office get pushed down, and what used to be traditionally on the street level gets pushed up into this kind of mid-level zone. So the in cities like Sydney, for instance, we're working on actually multiple projects, but this one that I wanted to show you is called Quay Quarter Sydney. It's under construction at the moment, and we provided master plan and a strategic planning and a way to think about how to use this as a catalyst to regenerate everything from the Sydney Opera House to Circular Quay to the Rocks, and then to the 3-block redevelopment area that's under construction now. So it's the kind of small circle at the top, along the red. But the way we were thinking about it and programming it was as a series of interconnected precincts around the central core of Sydney. So everything you see from the top of this diagram down to the lower portion takes about a 20-minute walk if you walked it really fast. But what we wanted to do was to create really a 24-hour city, or to be factually correct in Sydney, an 18-hour city, because Sydney was really effectively a 12-hour city that went from early morning to 6 o'clock. And the traditions of Sydney was that everyone would then go home to participate in other kind of life. What we're trying to do is to acknowledge the changes to young professionals, migration from internationals coming into the city, and create a desire to take advantage and program more benefits that would allow people to congregate and hang out together in what is a really spectacular environment. So we started by looking at all of the individual areas around Circular Quay, the sub-precincts, and began more traditionally with a series of more like landscape designs or environmental design to connect everything together. But what was really crucial in doing it was we faced very quickly the obstacles of what traditional design would run into, and began to attack it a different way, which is really the diagrams on the left-hand side. So those really represent simple program from traditional ways of separating different functions, from retail to living to F&B and everything in between, to more of an activity-based working model, which begins to merge and mix everything together and blur the boundaries between primary functions. And that really was to be reflective of what we know in Asia, but which was a little bit different for Australia. And then, sorry, can we go back one? And then the idea of collaboration, meaning to break down individual moments for the way that somebody might come into an office at 6, 7, or 8 o'clock in the morning, coming in from the suburbs using the ferries or transit or driving or biking, which is really big in Sydney, and everything that they actually do over the course of the day, and then the individual activities that we wanted them to do in the city rather than going back home or to the suburbs, and looking at all of the primary life of a neighborhood, all the individual functions, and begin to co-relate them in different ways. And so the idea was to create a kind of life way that would begin to mix everything together and use soft experiences and an idea of coding experiences as the underlying factor to then design on top of it a kind of carpet of greenery, and then refurbishment of some historical and heritage buildings, and then reconstruction of other offices and new construction as well on top to gain additional efficiency. So the programming diagrams were really crucial, and again, it's sort of odd to look at these now in this context of living in cities like Hong Kong, where life is so extremely vertical. There's a number of different urban conditions that everybody has to try to understand. So in this case, in Australia, the idea of going beyond the ground plane for these public functions was not something that they were actually accustomed to. So we worked very closely with the city to look at their plans for Sydney 2030 and beyond, which was really designing a much more active economy around urban core areas and to make a more efficient use of the land itself and existing and new properties. So the idea was really to push public life up into the sky and then push semi-public life and the functions of offices down to these mid-levels where everything would begin to mix. And one of the ways of actually doing that was in a very, very detailed way to look at primary precincts and different uses, what we called style, from work style to markets and food and music, trading, education, living, and public life. And what we did was basically to look at the available overall GFA, both horizontally and vertically, and we began to program this so that we created essentially a menu of experiences, which was multiple ones where each one looked a little bit different, depending on whether the emphasis was going to be on retail and F&B and entertainment versus workplace versus living and residence or culture. And each one was tested and examined against the intentions of the city to create this more public life and an extended one into the later hours and weekends versus the individual needs for the primary landowners and especially the ones operating the office, because that had the largest amount of area. So in doing so, we had to adapt and show different ways that the environments could be designed. So with this idea of blurring, rather than having simple secured offices, even if it could be done nicely, like, instead of a traditional office, you could design it at like a boutique hotel, for instance. We went a lot further to exploring this idea that the experience of walking into the precinct to go into the office would be going through essentially a market hall. And that really reflected the high degree of attention that Sydneysiders have towards great food and wine, the amount of attention that they actually put to it as a real cultural reflection of who they are. And even looking at upper levels of this, which is effectively an early version of a co-work space that would begin to look down onto the market hall / office zone entry experience, which began to then merge with street level activities with the idea that people could fluidly move up and down these areas as part of the overall office experience. And when you're seeing particularly on the right is the competition image. So for the master plan, a great company called 3XN won the design competition for the tower using the programming ideas, and they came up with a solution which is a series of rotated stacked office precincts, 3 to 4 levels at a time, with atrium spaces that would form social spaces up in the air, and that would allow for adaptations as you move up the project, but also the synchronizing the function of conversations up in the air down to these lower levels that we just explored. So the image on the left is showing you one of the elevated social hubs that's up in the sky. And the center image is actually not from the project, but something that we use very often where this idea of verticality is just incredibly important for dense Asian cities. One of the economic factors to really consider is that I'll just put it to kind of a metric. If an office space pays, say, $1, retail and F&B tenants will pay $3 to $4. So of course you want as much higher paying and more socially active spaces as possible, but there's a natural limit. And that's why generally if you look around KL, retail tends to be say 3 to 4 levels and not much higher, except in special occasions. In cities like Hong Kong, we've pushed that to up to 19 to 20 levels. But we couldn't do it if everything was ground plane based and moving up from ground up. It really does require this idea of integrated development or mixed use, where you have essentially a captive population that's coming up from the sky down to these lower levels. And now instead of just thinking that it's a podium and tower solution, we're really mixing these environments as you move up into the sky, including nearly to the tops as well. So just recapitulating the section that we showed earlier, which is an illustrative section of essentially the life of the project as you move up from, bookstores and bakeries, garden lounges, rooftop lounges, pool areas, and co-work spaces, all co-mingling as what used to be simply called an office precinct. And then just a quick image, which 3xn one with the view of the rotated towers that you see kind of on the right-hand side, looking out towards Circular Quay and the harbor. If we could play the next video, please. So that video, I mean, to be very frank, is a project we lost. So that was a paid design competition amongst a number of international firms for the Tencent campus in the Qianhai area of Shenzhen. It is under construction now, but we came in second place. So very unfortunately, we didn't win. But the reason I wanted to show that was, in my mind, I think that's one of the last more traditional ways of looking at workplaces and campuses. And the reason is that it was mandated in the competition that it's very much a top-down look at the beauty of this peninsula site in Shenzhen, and really architecture as branding. And so I don't think the beauty of architecture will ever really go away. But the nature of projects like that for us now, even just a year and a half later, is that it's highly driven by user experiences and adaptability. And I think that type of architecture, while it will not actually go away, you're going to begin to see a lot more ideas where you're marrying modular construction and idea of sustainable materiality with an ecosystem which tries to track changes much more rapidly, because the way that projects would sit relatively in stasis for a decade or 2 decades, I think those days are long gone. So this idea of verticality and change also is reflected in different kinds of projects. So in the Bangkok precinct of Hong Kong, we designed this project called Langham Place. Probably a few of you have been there because it's a very youth-oriented project. But it was to solve a specific thing, because in a district of tenement housing, which nobody really thought could be gentrified, there was already in progress a 60-story office building and a 700-room hotel on the next block. So the developer had tried a number of different kind of solutions by the time we came in, and what we did was to look at those 3 individual components: the the vibrancy and the eclectic nature of the neighborhood. And we designed a more of a retail and entertainment based solution that is vertical. So this is a very, very small site. We have, yeah, okay, thank you. So what you're seeing is it's by the tower was designed by a local architecture firm called Wong and L Young, and you're kind of just seeing the rooftop of our 15-level retail project. It's very, very small. The width of that block is only 44 meters. And the length of the retail piece is only 65 meters. So if you think about that as a kind of proportion, and what a general, let's say, atrium in a retail solution does, if we put an atrium space in there, we would only be left with about 25% of the footprint left, which would make it an unusable project. So we came up with a different idea for how to populate people over the 15 levels. Which also then takes advantage of the fact that it's a block away from the MTR stations. And so we began by pulling people in the basement levels into the project and then up 13 levels of upgrade. So 2 below and 13 levels above. Using kind of an idea of carving through this extremely dense block. And what you're seeing kind of in the lower cross-section diagram is what looks like an atrium space, but originally it was actually just a rooftop that was left over, and we worked with the city to be able to enclose that with the roof and capture it with the glazed curtain walls on the side to create an elevated garden room at level 4, with the promise back to the city that it would be operating 24/7. And the key to all this is the transport system. The system is actually an upside down system where from ground level, taking these long escalators, which move 4 levels at a time, it takes just under 8 minutes to get from street level to the top of the project. And where it says level 13 Sky Terrace, that's the final zone with this digital sky that's animated above that. And then from there, the idea is that you essentially wander down back through the project just using natural gravity in these very, very tight zones. Our inspiration programmatically was really a project called Shibuya 109 in Tokyo, which has very little architectural merit, but a project that we love because it's a 9-level project with small shops, with the idea that very young fashion designers would put up goods for 1 to 2 weeks at a time. And a lot of them only design and produce this in one shot. And the idea was really simple, and that was to take advantage of all the manufacturing that's available in this part of Asia very cheaply, with the idea that fashion and original goods would be there for a limited period of time and it would go away, never to return. And so it brings an intensely loyal group of people back all the time to this project in Tokyo. And the top half of this project had the same concept, designed with 2 meter by 2 meter modules for very young entrepreneurs to come in and try to target young professionals and kids in their teens. So it's really a project that's designed for very young people. And a lot of my friends, mothers and grandmothers, hate the project because it scares them because of sort of the extreme density and verticality of it. But it really wasn't designed for them. It really was very targeted for a select audience. The top of it originally was a skate park with a Vans shop. And our owner at the time didn't believe that anybody would actually go to it. So it was never executed this way. The weakest part of the project really is the top, and that's partially because of the mismatch with now a series of restaurants rather than something which targets very specifically the youth of this part of Kowloon, Hong Kong. And so, I'm still kind of hopeful that eventually that they will put in the original solution. Let's skip this because it's random. The idea for us in all our projects is really to try to create integration with mass transit. So TOD projects are incredibly important because it's really the much more sustainable delivery system. And this image from our project in Roppongi Hills, Tokyo, kind of looks at how to integrate a 300-year-old park that's been restored with the connections to the Roppongi Hill Station. And referring back to the programmatic elements, one of the things that's important for us to track is the changes to demographics and what actually happens to a project. So the elevation that you're seeing here is actually part of a major luxury street. But that project, we have it in the next one, right? Was actually changed from women's fashion to pets. Effectively, pet stores, pet fashion, pet grooming. And it's kind of funny transformation that we didn't really think about at the time, which was a real lesson for us to think about the changes to a city. Because again, it's logical today that if you go through the way that the Japan population has aged over the last 30 to 40 years, and they're one of the significant countries of the world that has been in negative population decline for a long period of time, what actually happens? So the economy for children's goods went down, but the economy for pets and pet goods and pet experiences actually went up. So in one of the most luxurious projects in all of Tokyo, you have this pet street, which we never would have predicted. But had we known that, we would have actually created a better integration to the park itself so that it would be a more fluid environment. And then I'm just going to kind of close with a project that is not ours, but one of my favorites. And I'm sure that a lot of you have been there if you travel to Bangkok. And it's a relatively small project called the Commons, which is about 5,000 square meters over multiple levels. And the distinction really is that, it's in a pretty interesting neighborhood called Tonglor, which has great restaurants and bars and really fun to be around. But this isn't a back block, so it has very poor accessibility. I think there's a number of great lessons here that's important for Malaysia as well. This is a project that is completely dedicated to food and all experiences related to food with a little bit of supporting retail. But primarily it's restaurants and street food that actually comes up from street level up about 4 levels above grade. The cross section that you're seeing on the right is the most significant architectural move because it is effectively the vertical circulation system and public theater that is actually combined. So the way to wind up the project is also the seating for live music and performances, and also just to hang out and eat outside. It's very much a mixture of indoor-outdoor environments. And programmatically, it's relatively simple. It has more street food down below, and then as you move up the project, it tends to get a little bit higher end with more formal restaurants at the top. I think the most significant part of this is really what Kun Vichari and Kun Varat, they're a brother-sister owner, and their journey, I think, is a really interesting one to follow because they started with a very simple idea to try to create more of what they experienced as students in the U.S. That they couldn't find back when they went back to Thailand and began to practice. So they wanted to create this sort of a casual informality, but in a slightly nicer setting. And so they developed this property, and then they ended up drifting towards a total F&B kind of solution. I've been talking to them a lot over COVID because they've opened up a second project, and then now they're working on a third project. And I think what's really interesting for what they're talking about is that they were really designing for communities, and they feel that they're more like community owners rather than just developers and architects. So I think the idea that we really think about the people that we're serving in terms of designers is really a fundamental one to learn. And this as a kind of piece that can be adaptive for any kind of environment, whether it's in an urban core situation or out in the suburbs, is an important one to continue to follow. Okay. I think that's the last kind of project that I wanted to show you. The main thing I think for us is I know that you must be looking at the formal design of architecture and planning, and we have deep respect for that, and it still occupies the majority of our time. But I think you have an opportunity to really look at the trends. And really think about the way that your habits personally must have changed, the idea of thinking about innovation and technology, and really to think about more of an inside-out process that will begin to reflect more of the habits of people and what you are wanting to experience also. So that's where I'm going to kind of end off, and I'll look forward to having a discussion with you.
Right. Very interesting project, and I can tell you that it's truly informative and it's truly inspiring, especially for the students who design urban designs or plannings, and especially for the architects, Phil. But I can tell you, urban designs provides a context sensitivity approach, to planning and designing state highways and other transport networks that the best meet the economics, environment, social, and also the considered as engineering requirements of an area. So using these multidisciplinary techniques contributes to the objective. So I believe that each project that you share with us today has a different constraint and a design outcome. Do you mind to share with us what are the good urban design outcomes, Phil?
I think our philosophy is really almost overly simple. It's not that easy to achieve, but I think the fundamentals that's really largely forgotten is we should be dealing with things like the measurement of happiness, for instance. I mean, I'm 100% sure that none of the architecture professors are using this as a fundamental basis for urban design or architecture, but the outcome must be beneficial to individual persons, and when people begin to interact, 2 people, 4, 8, and sometimes leading into crowds. And I think the formality of infrastructure and planning and architecture sometimes forgets that the overall intent is to provide shelter and comfort for people. And so for us, terms like activation and comfort really are as much of a driver for design as a spine or connections and other kind of more formal words. So I think it's important to think about how simple some of the reasons why we exist and why we do this work is, yet it's not really discussed sufficiently.
Right. I think, Phil, this is a very common question for students. They say that urban design will be achieved by ensuring the needs, for community and also natural environment and the built environment. They have to and to be considered in a creative way, multidisciplinary way from the start or over the planning and design process. So an urban design outcome might be an iconic. So for your opinion, does the urban design mean iconic, Phil?
Yeah, yes, yes and no. I mean, you were kind enough to mention that we've won a few awards in our company's history. Right. But of course, we're an old company, so that's averaging like 3 a year, so it's not that many. But the reasons that one tends to win awards is that iconic value, because the way that things are judged sometimes is a little bit superficial, I would say, but it's a kind of snapshot into something. So how strong the imagery is, architecture as physical branding, as representation for a whole slew of other things, of course, it's really incredibly important. And to a large extent, as an urban designer or architecture, that's the really fun part. It's the
Yeah.
shaping and making it really glossy and looking. So, I think I kind of somewhat avoided overemphasizing that. But that doesn't go away, and it still has to be or has to look beautiful or whatever inherent beauty you can
Right.
craft from all the kind of conditions. But I think looking underneath that is, of course, the emphasis of what I was trying to say, which is this forgotten side where how do you get to that sense of beauty? So I didn't show you this one project, but it's um, a 8-level tilted park project that we did in Osaka on top of a train station. That's won all kinds of awards.
Right.
And people look at it for its iconic value, and that's really what has given us a huge amount of credibility from cities around Asia Pacific. But what others don't talk about are the reasons why it is successful. It isn't just because of the natural beauty. It's the fact that using basic principles like passive sustainability, that we create a huge amount of human comfort there. So it's like 1/3 or cooler on this project on a summer day in Osaka than one
Yeah.
block away. And so if you think about this idea of human comfort, that also is equally as important as the beauty of the project, because as beautiful as it can be, unless you still believe in hermetically sealed interior indoor kind of projects, and especially coming out of COVID, where our relationship, I think, to things that are organic is much stronger now. These biophilic principles now really also begin to matter. So the challenge to your students really is that they should be a lot smarter than we are, right? So if we could only manage to design beautiful things on the outside, they'll be able to marry the two completely together and have greater reasons to create something which is beautiful on much stronger logic and foundation that impacts human beings a lot more closely.
Yeah, I agree with you. I admire your statement just now when you're saying that it's not only about beautiful, it's not only about safety and health, but it's about the human comfort there. One of the project that you share with us today that in Bangkok, I've been to that place, the Common, yeah.
Mm.
And experiences a very interactive spaces with a thematic approach and so on. But would like to relate one of the question from Facebook. The question is, the place is so beautiful, but he's concerned, or he or she concerned about the staircase. Yeah, looks
Yes.
seamless. What were the safety issues that you had to tackle in this design? I mean, the safetiness, especially we saw the staircase. I've been there before. I mean, it's not, but we're thinking about the safetiness and also about universal design as well.
Mm.
So, can you respond for that, Phil?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I really admire that project is that it's not that it's perfect, and really the brother and sister who own it,
Yeah,
really are very open about all the mistakes that they actually made. But what they've been able to do is adapt very, very quickly. Whereas I think the way that we were trained, and I think you too, once you design something, you put it into place, change is extremely difficult. And so even if something does
right.
not work, one simply lives with the inadequacies of a solution for a very long period of time. And I think what the Commons does is that it's not. I think it's a very pleasing looking project, certainly, but it's not incredibly precious. So that I think their ability to constantly tweak and adapt to conditions will be far greater, and that means a much more relevant and sustainable project. Because what we traditionally used to deal with is that every 8 to 10 years, an owner would go in and have to redo significant parts of the project. And particularly when it's more retail oriented, which is always
Yeah,
changing, that was much
yeah,
more the case. But if we take the principle that I think that they have done, where change, maybe it's not change, it's evolution. That a project is not fixed, but it's always being worked on. It's very organic, and it's almost like a living animal
Yeah.
that continues to adapt to the conditions. And I think that's the promise of a project like that.
It's about flexibility, I suppose. Yeah. I mean, this is the up-to-date question, the up-to-date concern about when you would this design still can be generally acceptable during the pandemic situation, since the vertical buildings, how limited people can use per time, especially talking about the social distancing implementation,
Yeah.
and dense area are more prone to issues related to the spreading of virus. So, what's your say about this
Yeah,
information?
I see that. Yeah, I see that question from Jason. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
an excellent question because
correct.
we are dealing with it. So yeah, especially in cities like Hong Kong, at the beginning of the pandemic, that was a very, very serious question. Would anybody want to go back to the office, for instance, or these kind of narrow, tall buildings? Would they really have a place because people felt so kind of unsafe? But I think a couple things have
Right.
happened in Hong Kong, which is clearly, even though people can work from home or possibly study from home, the need and the desire for people, human beings, to connect, maybe at a much higher level or more qualitative level, that's been generally confirmed by almost everybody. So maybe not in terms of the frequency, but definitely the desire is actually there. So urban core areas in particular, I think, will continue to have huge amounts of value simply because there's also other things associated with it. Great shops and bars and culture and everything else. And so that idea of mixing within a city area is actually there. What has changed is really the nature of space, I think, where if we take the idea of an office, we went from traditional offices to cubicles to open plan and flex and hot desking, and right now, and this is still to be borne out. It's sort of going back to this idea that there's a need for an office, some for safety reasons, but two, for the productivity of work, where you actually need some silence and ability to focus. But then you also need this engaged social time where people are kind of conversing. So the mathematics tends to be that generally people still need nearly as much office, but for different kind of functions, for better and better experiences. So we are talking about people still congregating, but at a greater distance in terms of the normal kind of work. So it's going to look a little bit different, but not the locations and not the desire to connect. And then in terms of the direct question that Jason is asking, even within the vertical projects that we're actually doing now, instead of the simple curtain walls with everything central air conditioning, we're really looking now in terms of facades that are operable and open that allow air movements through. And this is for Malaysians, it should be a really simple thing. Ken Yang has been talking about this for 30 years, and he's probably not at all popular anymore, but he was right? In the sense that whether it's a tall vertical building or not, I think the fundamentals of how buildings and environment engage each other is still the same. And maybe now we're finally over that period where everything has to be, Hong Kong is really extreme, like 20 degrees inside temperature.
Yeah.
And much closer to what Japan does, which is kind of warm AC and openable and operable and getting fresh air through.
Yeah, precisely. I mean, to relate that response, there's a question from Rin Wong. What are the key or fundamental or even philosophy to achieve the simplicity urban design in details that we should take note of?
Sorry, could you repeat the question?
Okay, I repeat the question. The question is from Rin Wong. Yeah, what are the key or fundamental or philosophy to achieve the simplicity urban design in details that we should take note? The fundamental.
Yeah. If I understand the question Um, the I'll give you a sort of a bad case, and that is essentially like town planning principles in Hong Kong. The success of a city like Hong Kong actually meant that uh, planning regulations that was always inadequate was reinforced and continued to be reinforced because economically Hong Kong has been an extremely successful city for virtually nonstop for 40 to 50 straight kind of years.
Right.
So people made do. I think it's frankly wrong, and fundamentally, what will inhibit Hong Kong's growth into the future is its lack of balance, its lack of public space, the extreme stresses that a city like this has to endure. And so, the urban acupuncture is a term that's been used for a long period of time. But if the planning laws need to be changed, it's to allow for literal and metaphorical breathability within these kind of very dense kind of cities. So obviously there are practitioners who really should be studied in great detail. And I think, like, for instance, we do it more from an organic process, but the ones who would really be well known are, like, let's say, Gell architects, right? So Jan Gell's been out there for, since the 1970s, really talking about this, where the way to design, or the way to urban design is really to think about fundamental human factors and try to understand what creates comfort and happiness, and then build rules on top of that. And so a few people like that are able to go into cities and actually begin to essentially create a surgical process to allow for recommendations to deconstruct this. But if we could start fresh from a series of guidelines that actually starts from this humanistic level, then of course you're going to have a much better chance. As you know, most of our cities have not been designed this way. Urban design, actually, even just to say urban design, there are very few guidelines that cities actually use in order to design cities. So planning, building uses, or transport or infrastructure has largely been what has been used to divide up in parts of our cities, but we're in a process where we have to reverse that process. I do have to say a couple of cities I admire deeply in terms of their consciousness for this is Sydney and Melbourne. I think in particular, because I know I have so many Malaysian friends who went to universities there. They're cities that really for the last 2 decades have really begun to codify the language of urban design on human terms, and really are diving into it. And so the nomenclature to talk about urban design, I think it's really best in those cities in particular, and I also have a lot to learn from them.
Precisely. When you mentioned about the programmatic precinct in one of your slides, a question from Guma Sylvester, one of the Massa committee members. If were to say these precincts are more intertwined with each other rather than being planned in different parcels, would this be a better in terms of urban planning design, Phil?
Yes, absolutely. I will steal this term from Guma for future conversations with my clients to say intertwined. I usually use the term blurred or blurring, and I think we're kind of relating the same kind of issues, because the idea is not to be fixed in terms of its uses. And part of it is that just, again, referring back to COVID, but also, if you think about, the students at Massa versus like when I went to school and then everything in between, all of our habits have changed over a long period of time. Most of our projects, these large projects take, 5 to 7 years from inception to completion. And, that's half a decade or more where a huge amount of change is occurring faster and faster. So the needs as defined at the beginning of a project can be outdated by the time it's actually completed. And with the older ideas, it's very difficult to continue to adapt that. So the simple approach that we're actually taking and really challenging our clients on and cities is simply to say, well, we understand that there may be 4 or 5 key functions, but to allocate specific kind of space, volume, or connectedness has to be far more adaptable. And so, if we simply take the approach that it's, let's say, in the extreme, it's a volume of spaces, and within that, using prefabrication technology and better materials and more sustainable materials, we could be slotting in different kind of uses and changing it out as those needs actually also begin to adapt. So, there's a project on the Gold Coast where with Australia and the extremely high requirement for car parks, which makes no sense in the long term, but in the current Australian standard is required. What we have been working on and advising is that we build car parks with not at, let's say, 2.8 or 3 meters floor to floor, but we build them at 6 meters floor to floor. And then we put in a metal pan in the middle that can be used as a car park for the next, say, 5 years. Our guess is to be optimistic to say that between increases in mass transit and the way that AV is working, where Uber and Lyft and all these kind of technologies will allow people and car ownership to go down, that those car parks with the double volume spaces can then truly be adapted for other kinds of uses without having to deconstruct and rebuild, since concrete itself has such an adverse impact on embedded carbon and carbon emissions.
Right. There's another question, quite challenging question here, Phil. So in relation with the current pandemic, will there be a huge shift towards the way or even policy of urban planning, especially when densification has becoming bad perception among publics, although it's one of the many main aspects that contribute towards the development of urban city?
Yeah, that's a challenging question. It's a big debate right now because I think there's various points of view that can support either end of the argument. There are cities, especially in Asia, where mass transit tends to be more efficient, where existing urban core areas it will require adaptation, but because it's already there and because there's already an efficient population and means of delivery, then we should be in the idea or the mode of adopting rather than continuing to build out. Cities within secondary locations, I think it's logical to think that we shouldn't be overbuilding and over densifying anymore for safety reasons and other reasons. But it really will require something else as well, because if you want to go to more of a satellite center that's within walking distance or 5-10 minute mass transit commute, I think that's a wonderful kind of idea. But a lot of cities, and I would argue KL has a real challenge, for instance, where people still are going to be hopping into their cars and having to drive. And so from a total environmental design perspective of a region or a metropolis, it's solving one problem but creating other problems. And so I think the holistic strategy really needs to be thought through before it can really be resolved. I'm personally changing my mind a bit, because I'm definitely a believer in urban core areas and all the vitality that it actually gives. But I do see the benefits of being able to live in more affordable areas or in quieter areas or more green areas and still being able to find productive work. So I think it's a kind of blended strategy that will win out in the end.
Yeah. I think this is one of my last question to you. I mean, this is my personal question. I love to hear from you, because I'm also teaching urban design to the students, master students. They need to see the projection here. In order to influence the physical design direction of a project, urban design must be addressed in the early planning stages. As an urban design approach has the I can consider as the greatest influence, and it could be highly cost effective when applied in the planning stages of a project. So
Mm.
it must be a continued through all subsequent stages of design, and then finally monitored so that the desired outcomes will be delivered. So I want to
Yeah.
hear from you so that you can share to all the students here, when should urban design to be considered based on your experience here now?
Um, uh, right now, I mean,
Yeah,
as early as possible, because I think everything else kind of comes second in a way, and I guess the urban design, there's a formality to that as well. It's
yeah,
not all sort of the soft arts, but I think what we're talking about is a more holistic way of thinking about design to factor in essentially user experience.
yeah,
And I think that the creating essentially a vision for the type of community that you desire really has to come first.
mm,
Then the elements that begin to match essentially precinct desires that's more environmentally driven to this
yeah,
idea of what the community wants comes second. And then the formalism really comes third, and then planning on top of that. It's a kind of reverse order because
yeah,
traditionally that human element is what we end up with last, and we try to adapt. And of course, we're all very adaptive creatures, but we're already dealing with a stacked deck that goes against it. I there's a I would love to do a program for your students sometime, which is what I
yeah.
do in Hong Kong high schools and universities called Urban Plan. In Singapore, we do it for public officials, and I think it's the right model. And we do it in order for all these highly stressed high school students who are very test taking oriented, trying to get into good universities. And give them an opportunity to learn in an interactive way. But the idea is very simple. It's a neighborhood building exercise, and it's
Right.
really how to design a resilient neighborhood from, we have a director of finance, planning, sustainability, community engagement, and client liaison. And teams of 5 students actually work together to design 4 city blocks with context. And so
Mm,
when you see that approach, what actually happens is that all stakeholders have to be respected, and each person playing a role has to have an equal amount of authorship over the final scheme. So there is architecture and urban design, but it's not weighed or judged any more highly than the response to community letters and senior citizens and people who want community engagement. And so I think that's more the approach that I see as being the future of urban design.
right, right. That's a good insight. I mean, there's a good sharing that, you know, people ask the students, this keep thinking in Kuala Lumpur, it's different approach because they be somehow, how does the project team relate to urban design? They keep asking it.
Mhm.
So as urban design is a holistic approach to development.
Yes.
It must be fully embrace the skill of relevant professionals, and this include planners and also environmental managers who set the broad framework, architects, civil
Mhm.
engineers, or maybe even landscape architect, or even shape the project into the coherent design, like ecologists, traffic impact assessment experts, noise consultant, ecologists, or even the heritage consultant, even other experts who advise on designs field.
Yeah.
So we're going to end up our session here. Is there any final words from you, Phil? I'm so honored to hear from your sharing input here, and then I love to keep in touch with you back. To call you maybe for other universities event program. So any final word from you, Phil?
No, yeah, please stay in touch. As I said, it's been kind of an honor. I'm usually completely terrified speaking to students because I just figure that they're the most open-minded and critical. So, after you've been practicing for a long period of time, I think one does kind of tend to forget some of the raw inspiration that somebody with a completely open mind and approach and fresh experiences actually bring to our respective fields. I think it's a wonderful time for particularly digital natives to take what they just know intuitively, and can access and resource in such a speedy and quick kind of way, and to bring to all these complicated problems that probably my generation created, right? So we created 30, 40, 50 years of success, but those foundations, as it turns out, has real frailty to it. So it doesn't mean that we're going to destroy and redo our cities, but I think there's so many different elements of inspiration and technology and insight and culture and physiology and behavior science that we can bring to bear, that our entire profession is going to look very, very different in 10 years, certainly, possibly sooner, but certainly in 10 years. And I think that's what all the students of MASA have an opportunity to do. And they should find it completely open and interesting. And whatever people like us may put as barriers as you complete your university studies, don't listen to any of us. I mean, these barriers are artificial, and we need better solutions from smarter people and newer and younger generations.
Thank you so much, Phil. I mean, I personally, as a urban designer as well, a placemaker and also an architect, I'm also inspired your knowledge, your experience, sharing your projects, and thank you again on behalf of PAM and also MASA, Malaysian Architecture Student Alliance, that we are so honored to have you today, and really grateful to have your contribution of your time and your knowledge. And I would like to take opportunity to say thank you to Datuk Tan Paying, our PAM past president as well. She's the one who connecting us, you know what I mean? So really hope to see you in future. I mean, most welcome to Kuala Lumpur after all this pandemic situation is over, hopefully. So for all the students, today we have a very great information, great sharing, great knowledge to be shared. So I hope that you all be inspired by our Mr. Phil Kim. Remember this, whatever good things that we build end up building us. So best way to change future is to design it. Great design is not the solution. It is the elimination of the problem. So with that, Phil, I hope to see you again. We keep in touch, and I pass back to Emilia, our MC today. Be well. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Architect Adrianta, and thank you, Mr. Phil, for giving us an interesting and eye-opening sharing, as well as giving us very useful advice, especially for us students and young architects. All right, so this marks the end of our talk today. Thank you everyone for joining us on today's online sharing session. And thank you so much to our very special guest, Mr. Phil, once again, for sharing your experiences with us. We hope everyone really enjoyed it and gained a lot of knowledge. Also, again, a very big thank you to Architect Adrianta for being the moderator. And last but not least, I would like to thank Pam and Architects for giving us the opportunity to have this collaboration in Architects Online Fast Forward 2021. Do keep in touch and follow us on MASA's Instagram and Facebook page for more updates, and do check out Architects Online for more interesting webinar sessions. Also, if you haven't already done it yet for the students, you can register for PAM membership at www.mypam.org.my. There are a lot of benefits for architecture students that await. Until then, stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll catch you next time. Have a good day and goodbye.
Be well. Bye.
Bye. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.